Workflow 8 is all about shifting from teacher assessment to self-assessment. And this relates a lot to what you were talking about in Workflow 7, Kat, where you're lugging around these canvas bags. I had friends who basically looked like they were going to like the departures area in Logan. They would have like these carry-on crates. I'm like, what are you doing? Just got to bring home those math assessments. And so much of the traditional model was that teachers had to assess everything as if students were not capable of self-assessment. So in this workflow, we really want to provide concrete strategies that learners of all ages can use to actually go through the process of thinking about their learning in relationship to some exemplars and co-created success criteria, and have students really begin to understand when their work is done well and when they need to return and go through that revision cycle.
And it's really critical, like missing that step where we don't ask students to look at exemplars and have conversations with peers and try to identify what is strong and where the gaps or the weaknesses and that kind of higher level thinking about the product before they dive in and try to create something themselves is so incredibly powerful. We also talk about, kind of routines for ongoing self-assessment, right? Typically when we are in a unit of study or a learning cycle, as teachers, we know what the target standards or learning objectives are, but really making those visible for students and carving out time in our class. And I often did this as like an online station as part of a station rotation, or it was built into like a playlist where students had to pause and take 20 minutes and, grab something you worked on in the last week and compare it to kind of like the learning objective or the target standard and start thinking about what are you noticing in your work? Where are the strengths? Where are you seeing yourself making progress? Where might you be stagnating or stuck and need additional support? Really building in that time for them, again, to stretch those metacognitive muscles and learn more about themselves as students and hopefully appreciate that we're asking them to do this work for a purpose. It's not busy work. It's not just to fill the space. But I think sometimes we know why we're asking kids to do something, but without them going through that self-assessment, they don't always appreciate that why behind the work. We also talk about the value of things like student portfolios and having kids really engage in kind of that self-assessment, but then publishing their thinking about their progress in really dynamic ways.
And the thing is, we've done this as adults for years. Like, if somebody's going to come in and observe your classroom and you kind of have a debrief afterwards, it's like, how do you think that went? What do you think went really well? Like, we are given the opportunity as adults to really provide a self assessment and reflection of our learning before somebody was like, well, let me talk about my perception and let's talk about whether there's a disconnect there. But I think that it doesn't mean that we're not going to assess student work. It doesn't mean that we're not going to provide feedback, of course, as we've been talking about, but that students really need to drive that initial reflection to think about how did they do, how did they show up, and how do they feel like they compare to some predetermined co-created criteria.